No, it's ad hoc, depending on when issues arise. But then we also have a separate ongoing program that is separate from these discussions. Hello, Bishop. Good to see you. So thank you, Bhavani, for joining the rep desk. Now we are called the Justice, Reconciliation, or Justice, Peace and Reconciliation desk. So the session is going to be a discussion on the proposed anti-terrorism bill, and Bhavani Fonseca is going to be a resource person. She is a lawyer who qualified in law from the University of Bristol, and then did master's degrees in Denver and in Harvard. And some of us haven't seen you, but I think most of us have heard about you. And although we haven't met physically, we have seen you on YouTube and on television and so on. And Bhavani is a senior researcher at the Center for Policy Alternatives. So we look forward to your talk or your presentation to us, which is about 20 minutes. And then we'll open it for a discussion. We have online members as well as us physically here. Over to you, Bhavani.
Thank you. Does everyone hear me and online as well? Yeah, okay. So I've prepared a PowerPoint which will help, and it's with you so you can share with anyone. Because first of all, I want to say the anti-terror, the proposed act, and I'll refer it to as ATA, it's massive. I mean, it's 95 pages in the English, and in the Sinhala, it's 101 pages. So it's quite a lot to cover. What I'll do is I'll just flag some issues, and I understand Ruki will join online as well. Okay, so Ruki may also touch upon some aspects, but what I'll do is just cover some of the broad concerns with the bill. And just to maybe the first slide, if I can have the first slide. So I'll get right into it. The bill was gazetted in March, in a couple of weeks ago, and that was the first time that we came across this bill, and till then it was something we were told was coming. So a couple of weeks before the new year, we saw this and we were very concerned because of what it was trying to introduce. Now, the main purpose, what the government is trying to say, is that this is to replace the Prevention of Terrorism Act, the PTA, which was brought in as a temporary law in the 70s, and that remains in the books even 44 years later. So the PTA at that time was brought in by the then government on a particular basis of saying we need to address concerns in the north and east, and for 6 months. But what has happened is it became a permanent law, even though the title says temporary provisions. Now, the concern with the ATA is, and I'll go into some of the provisions, the ATA, in my personal opinion, is much worse than the PTA, though the government is saying that this is a progressive law, that this is an improvement. So what we seem to be having is a bad law, the PTA, which everyone I think is aware, has been used to target minorities, critics, political opponents, lawyers, media, with very concerning lack of due process safeguards, that with all its problems, all of its problems, looks mild compared to the ATA. That's the crux of where we are. Now, ATA, there are, I would say, two broad areas of improvements, and I'll say that up front before we go into the problems. One is the fact that it has removed confessions. So PTA, one of the biggest problems was anyone who's arrested, what they say can be used in a court of law as evidence. And forced confessions led to a lot of problems, including torture and threats against individuals. So that, and I'm going very quickly because it's a lot to cover, has been removed under the ATA. So that's one positive thing. The second positive thing is the role of the magistrate in the scheme of what has been proposed in the ATA, and I'll go into that. The magistrate has a bit more oversight compared to the PTA in terms of detentions. So those, I would say, are the two broad, two big areas, but positives. The others, as I'll take you through, are extremely concerning. The next slide, please. So the first thing I would like to also, before we go into some of the specifics, is what is terrorism? What is defined by terrorism? And this is, again, there's quite a lot of pages into it, but the broad comment with the definition, it's extremely vague, it's extremely broad. And in a law, and this is international standards, when it comes to terrorism, special rapporteurs and the UN Human Rights Committee have said for any law, it has to be very clear, very precise, very narrow. Otherwise, it becomes open to abuse. So why I say it's broad and vague is there are particular words used in terms of explaining what terrorism is that could lead to questions of whether someone protesting could be seen as a terrorist. Someone who is critical of the government or the official positions could be labeled as a terrorist. Now, there's also broad, very political terminology such as if it's a threat to the integrity and sovereignty of the country, could be anything that could be classified as falling within the broad ambit of terrorism. Anyone who's inciting ethnic, religious, or making statements that could be seen as incitement, could be seen as a terrorist action. Now, why I raise particularly these two is this is in the international terrorism standards. These don't come into the terrorism language. This is something very specific that the drafters here have brought in. And this is also within a country that has other issues, political, ethnic. We've come through several decades of cycles of violence. One needs to recognize that when you talk about incitement, incitement could mean anything. Now, if you look at the violence that happened even after the Digana violence, the Aludgama, when minorities were particularly targeted, when the incitement came from the majority community, there was really no action taken. And it's also very subjective. Now, when you have that in a terrorism proposed law, the way it could be used can be extremely worrying. Who decides? Who decides whether there is a threat to the integrity, sovereignty of the country? Having a conversation like this, could that be perceived as a threat to the integrity, sovereignty of a country? And it says integrity, sovereignty of Sri Lanka or any other country. So that's also extremely broad. So that's just an example. There's a couple of pages. But the other dimension with the broad definitions is that it says anyone who's seen as obstructing essential services, i.e., if you're doing a protest and you're perceived as blocking a road, you could be classified as a terrorist, not that you're being a nuisance. Now, remember, in the Sri Lankan legal scheme, in the penal code and other laws, there are particular offenses that can be used against those who are a nuisance. That has happened before. But this is now all going to be brought in under this proposed law. So this is why it's very, a terrorism law can be done, but when you have very broad terminology that could be interpreted in different ways, that can lead to abuse. Next slide. So very broadly, the other dimension is that the powers of particular state officials, that's the police, the security forces, is very broad in this proposed law. So one is the police, the military, the Coast Guard can arrest, detain anyone they think could be falling within the terrorism categories. So someone walking on the beach, someone on a boat, I mean, this could be anything because threat to integrity and sovereignty of the country could mean anything, could be arrested by any of those individuals and kept for 24 hours, kept for 24 hours without producing to anyone else. So within the 24 hours, anything could happen. The proposed law says within 24 hours, the person arrested by any such person needs to be produced before the nearest police station. So if someone's arrested now till tomorrow evening, they don't need to be produced before the police. And so that includes the military. That includes the Coast Guard. The question is why such broad powers are given, and why, the big question is why a magistrate is not involved immediately. That's a criticism even coming from the legal fraternity. Why is there no check from the judicial arm? Because arrest, detention, there should be a check. If one arm has such broad powers, within a scheme which has very broad terminology, could lead to abuse. So that's another dimension in terms of limited judicial oversight over the scheme of these arrest, search operations, all of that. Next slide, please. I'm going to leave the slide so you can look at it. The other, and I just want to flag this, another concerning issue is, as you know, Sri Lanka has a moratorium on the death penalty. This brings in the death penalty. Now, we don't know why that has been done, because a couple of weeks ago, the Attorney General's Department in court, because we're challenging the death penalty in the Supreme Court, came to court and said, we are not going to implement the death penalty. But a couple of weeks later, we see it brought in this law. Now, a government can come to court and say, we are not going to implement something. That's a statement they make in court. But as long as it's in the law books, it could be implemented anytime. So there is a worry that this government might say they're not going to implement it because of potentially international obligations, GSP plus, all of that. But whatever the reasons, they have given a promise, but the next government may change that policy. So just a commitment to court doesn't mean it's not ever going to be implemented. As long as it's in the law books, it's very, very problematic. Next slide, please. So I mentioned this before, that the search, arrest, detention powers are extremely broad. Under the ATA, it gives 24 hours, and only after 24 hours do they produce to the police. Within that, and the history of Sri Lanka, one needs to be very mindful that there could be abuse within that time period. And we can go into detail if it's not clear, but, and the fact that there is no independent oversight, i.e., the magistrate or the Human Rights Commission has no access, because no one may know for that first 24 hours where that person is being held. That is extremely worrying. Next slide. So there are two broad areas. I'll go into the next few slides. And again, I'll move very quickly because quite a bit to cover, but one particular issue I have with this is detention orders, and I'll go into it in a bit. One is the detention orders, who issues it, what can be done with it. The other is the powers of the executive president. Now, this is in a context where the last few years, but specifically last year, there was a call to abolish the executive presidency. That was a very loud call considering the economic crisis and people realizing that power with one individual office is problematic. There has to be checks and balances. Now, within that context, and last year we saw the 21st Amendment being brought on the premise there should be more checks and balances. This proposal is trying to consolidate the powers of the executive president further. So while the demands of the people are, we need checks and balances, we need accountability, we need reforms, we have a law under the guise of addressing terrorism that gives broad powers to the executive president. Now, one is the proscription orders. That is a power that the president has under this proposed law, where the president can issue a proscription order against any organization for 1 year. And that power, one would ask, okay, on what basis does the president decide? According to this, it's on reasonable grounds. Now, reasonable grounds could be the president wakes up one day and says, I don't like the work of a particular organization because they're critical. Or we don't like a meeting that was held. We don't like particular awareness raising programs. It could be anything. But any organization could face this prospect where the president decides on his own to prescribe an organization for 1 year. There is a fora to challenge that, but as many know in the court system, you're lucky if you even get heard within a couple of months. So, and you need resources, all of that to challenge something. But one individual having such broad powers is also worrying because he doesn't need to go to a magistrate to get an order. He can decide for 1 year to shut an institution down. It could be a media institution, it could be a civil society institution, it could be a humanitarian organization. You know, someone told me today, I mean, I mentioned this is the third meeting I'm having to talk about this, and one group, media, some media institutions were asking, look, if we report on a hartal, you know, we had the hartal in the north and east the last this week. Now, if we report on that and we show images, can we get shut down? And I said, according to this, the president has the power because he could say that kind of footage could lead to either incitement, remember the terminology, or a threat to the integrity and sovereignty of the country. That interpretation is with one individual. That is the problem. So prescribing an organization that ties with the president. Next slide. the fact that, and this is something very even media didn't realize till we started talking about it, that there are restrictions on what can be reported, what can be reported in the mainstream media, in print media, in TV, on websites, that media will face restrictions on what they report if it's perceived as a terrorism activity. Now, again, who decides terrorism activity? If it's a broad definition of terrorism, if there's a reporting that's critical, could be considered a terrorism activity. And when the powers are so much with the executive president, the police, the military, this could also be abused. And media also could face the whole prospect of being prescribed. Now, prescription has happened before. Under the PTA, we've had organizations being prescribed. And as you know, those organizations that were prescribed, it was near impossible to remove that prescription. So having things dangling over your head when media is supposed to independently report could really shut down that window of critical reporting, critical conveying of information. So that dimension is also there. Next slide. So we come to, and I'm just kind of quickly moving to detention orders. I'll go into some of the other things that the president has, but on the detention order, because this is a big area. Now, under the PTA, a detention order can only be issued by the Minister for Defense. And at the moment, the Minister for Defense is the president. So the last detention orders that were issued, that was last year against the protesters, was issued by the president, a detention order of 3 months. Even before that, we've had cases like Hijaz Hizbullah, Thisanaigam. Those detention orders came from the president, well, the defense minister, most times the president. Now, what this is trying to do, the ATA, is that the detention powers will be given to a DIG. The DIG decides on reasonable grounds. This reasonable grounds keeps coming up in this law, but it's not defined. Anyone on reasonable grounds can take action. On detention orders, a DIG on reasonable grounds can issue a detention order for 3 months. But this is not limited to one individual like the PTA, it's one individual. The ATA, when they say DIGs, we actually checked how many DIGs are in this country. There's over 60 DIGs in Sri Lanka. Some are senior DIGs, others are DIGs across Sri Lanka. Over 60 individuals will have power to decide whether he or she, we have a few women DIGs, that's why I say he or she, can decide on reasonable grounds. Remember the broad premise of terrorism under this, on reasonable grounds, decide something would fall under terrorism, so a person needs to be investigated, they are to be detained for 3 months. Now, the DIG issues the detention order, the first detention order for 3 months, then it could be renewed for 1 year, up to 1 year. After the first 2 weeks, every 2 weeks, a person detained under a detention order needs to be produced before a magistrate. So as I mentioned at the outset, that's one positive dimension. The magistrate has oversight. But the fact that 60 odd individuals across Sri Lanka has this power raises alarm. Because even when one individual, the defense minister had it, challenging such detention orders were near impossible. Individuals were in detention for sometimes years before a case could be taken up. Now you have 60 individuals, and as someone mentioned, it could be a policeman who could be a personal dispute. It could be something politically they disagree. It's not terrorism per se, but because the definitions are broad, an individual in the ranks of a DIG can issue a detention order. So I would say this is an extremely worrying issue, and it's actually much worse. PT is bad enough. This is much worse. Next slide. So I mentioned the one positive is that the magistrate has some improvements in terms of arrest detention. They can access a detainee. A detainee has to be produced before a magistrate every 2 weeks. A magistrate can access a detention center anytime. So there is greater access, or there's meant to be greater access. How this is also implemented, we'll have to see. So the role of the magistrate and access to detainees somewhat is improved compared to the PTA, but how this is going to play out, whether the magistrate actually can access, though the powers are provided, will also have to be seen. But at least in the law books, that is some improvement. The magistrate can check if there's been any force or torture use, send a person to be get medical assistance, like if there's any suspicion of the police using force, can make sure that the person is protected. All of that is there. So at least on that, that's why I said there's some improvements in terms of the magistrate's role in terms of detention, but that is very limited compared to the whole other areas. Next slide. So places of detention also, as I mentioned, magistrate can access. That's again an improvement, but whether it is going to be a regular visit, we will have to see. Next slide. So again, so detention I mentioned is one very concerning area. The other one is, as I mentioned, prescription, president's powers. That's one. The president has some other areas that other powers that I think are worth looking at as well. One is on rehabilitation. Now, I wanted to specifically mention this because in the past, successive governments have used rehabilitation to target individuals. And rehabilitation, one assumes, go through a particular process. But in Sri Lanka, rehabilitation, at least the state rehabilitation processes, are very much linked to the military. It's a military run operation. If you look at in the last 15, 20 years, that has been the case. There's a very close involvement of the military. So the question is really, who decides what rehabilitation is in Sri Lanka? That is also when the previous government in 2021 brought in regulations on de-radicalization and sending people for rehabilitation under the PTA. That was in March 2021. When those regulations came out, we looked at it and we were very worried because again, there was very broad definition. There was no due process. An individual can decide in the executive arm to send someone for rehabilitation for 2 years. We were able to challenge it in the Supreme Court. There's a stay order in the Supreme Court now, and the government is unable to implement it till the Supreme Court hears those cases, fully hears those cases. So it's been stopped. That was in 2021. Last year, in September last year, the government tried to bring this Rehabilitation Authority Bill, which was extremely broad. It was on the premise of drug rehabilitation, but it had a category of any other person. Again, we went to the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court struck that provision down, saying this is very vague. You cannot have that in a law. You can have it for drug rehabilitation if there's a clear scheme, clear process. So that law passed because they had to bring in amendments, the government. So there is a rehabilitation bureau now under law, but for very specific purpose. This, the ATA is trying to bring rehabilitation back again, but it could be for anyone, and the president again has the power to decide what that program entails. So things they tried through other means, through the PTA, through another law, when they failed because the court stepped in, now they're trying to bring as terrorism. This is something to also be mindful, and the president has the power. The next slide. The other one is also the whole issue of the president's powers to issue regulations. And that is concerning because the president can issue regulations at any given time. PTA provides a similar power. Under that is when they try to bring in the regulations in 2021 for rehabilitation, which was struck down. This provides the same thing. Now, again, president, as I mentioned before, the presidency without much check to have such broad powers could be used if it's not under this president, by a future president, could be used in any manner. Because it doesn't say what kind of regulations, what needs to be done. So they could bring in anything under regulations. And the worry is that one individual decides. It doesn't need to go to the courts. And they present to Parliament after some time. So for the first month, the regulations could be operational, unless some of us find out and we go to court and challenge it. There is no way one can stop regulations being issued by the executive president. Now, we have had some success challenging certain things in the Supreme Court, and I think that's a positive thing. There is no guarantee that's going to happen in the future. So I come back to this point, when there is something in a law, even if they say, oh, we won't use it, we won't target you, we promise the court we won't use, it's in the law. It can be used anytime. If it's not this president, it could be used by a future president. So the fact that one individual in the office of the executive president has such broad powers under this is problematic, but it's compounded when those definitions of what terrorism is so broad and one individual can decide on reasonable grounds leads to really extremely worrying concerns. Last slide. Okay, so the last slide, these are two new things that the ATA is trying to do. And that is with the detention. Now I mentioned the detention is very much with the police. The DIG decides for 3 months to detain someone. Now, in the present scheme, the government will say, well, now we have the board of review that one can appeal to if there's a detention order. On paper, it looks fine. It's another appeal process. The problem is the board of review is appointed by the president and is headed by the Secretary of Defense and 2 other individuals. So it's individuals appointed by the president, one with a military background, the other 2 could be very loyal to the executive president. So you have detention orders issued by 60 or DIGs. If we feel, so if someone issues a DIG issues a detention order against Bhavani Fonseca, the appeal I have is to the board of review, and the board of review is the defense secretary and 2 others appointed by the executive president. They can say no. Then I go to the independent review board, again a new entity. The government will say, see, you have checks, but the independent review board is also appointed by the executive president. So you see a process where it's heavy on the executive president's office, broad powers given to the police, the defense establishment. The role of the judiciary is very limited. I mean, there's some access to them by the magistrate, but limited. So overall, and I'll end here, overall, this law went through the drafting with no consultations as far as we know. The minister himself has now said it was a committee comprising of lawyers. The Bar Association yesterday came out and said certain amendments need to be brought in. They were not consulted, but there has been no consultation. There's no explanation given other than saying this is a progressive law. But the fact that broad powers are given with limited checks, limited oversight, and that the definition could be anything from a discussion to a protest to an article that's written. Now remember, Tissanayagam was arrested, detained, prosecuted, and convicted for an article he wrote, got 20 years imprisonment. That whole process was problematic, the way it worked. Here, the definitions are extremely broad, and anything could be considered a terrorism act because of the way that language has been framed. So 80 on the whole, now it hasn't been tabled, it's gazetted, but if it gets tabled, then you have a process of 2 weeks to challenge. The Supreme Court then decides. But after that, citizens have very limited scope to challenge this or to bring about amendments. So the main demand of many of us has been to withdraw this bill. Withdraw it, have consultations, fine, you want an anti-terror law, then do it properly, have very clear definitions, have very clear checks and balances. So keeping this in the hands of a few individuals is extremely, extremely worrying. So at the moment, the bill is gazetted but not presented, but could be presented any minute, and then the 2 weeks time starts running. So it's very important. I mean, it's in a way heartening to see much interest in this. But if action is not taken, this could stay in the books for much longer than the PTA, which started as a temporary law. But the way this could be used as a weapon is much more problematic. Thank you.
Thank you, Bhavani. Bhavani. So the next speaker is Ruki Fernando, who I think many of us know. But Ruki is a human rights activist and also a ground level activist who has worked in many parts of the country, including the North, on a number of social justice and human rights issues. And he has also worked with the rep desk on many occasions. So Ruki, we will ask you to speak. And after that, we'll open up for a time of discussion and questions. Over to you, Ruki.
Okay, thank you. Good evening to all. And I would have preferred to join physically, but this morning I was also at a very similar but much longer discussion in Trincomalee, also about the ATA with some journalists and activists, and there were some mixed reactions. So I will maybe the discussion I would share about that. I'll try not to repeat what Bhavani said. Generally about what I would call terror laws and human rights. Terror laws and emergency laws usually tend to violate human rights. That is the general tendency, not only in Sri Lanka, not only under this government, but in general, across the world and in Sri Lanka by many governments. I'm including emergency laws as well. Human rights principles generally supports the countering of terrorism, but without violating human rights. Sometimes we hear governments saying that terrorism must be countered even at the cost of violating human rights. So, but that is not human rights principles. And human rights law, both international and national, says human rights should not be compromised for any reason. So that's the kind of perspective that I kind of come from. And in general, rulers tend to terrorize people. So they will say, but keep calm, trust us, we will take care of your problems, whether it's an economic crisis or anything else. Don't question, don't get too excited, but just trust us. No, but generally, we end up being terrorized by different rulers. And also, I want to mention that we also have a vast area of criminal law, Although I'm not a lawyer, as a citizen, I'm somewhat conversant that they cover vast range of offences and proceed. There's also criminal law procedures. And I think what is unique to me is that they offer some protections and due process to suspects and accused. Emergency laws, what I would call extraordinary laws or exceptional laws, are for exceptional situations and meant for short periods. And they generally curtail protections and due process. That is by nature. And our executive president, who already has a lot of power, has absolute discretion without even being subject to scrutiny to declare a state of emergency. So I will not go very much in detail. It could be challenged later on, but at the point of declaration, the president has the power to declare a state of emergency and subsequently regulations. And this has been done many times. And during the war in particular, Sri Lanka was kept almost in a permanent state of emergency. So, and these are some examples that I found in the media reports of how the emergency laws have been used. To ban an anti-war film, to censor newspapers. So terror laws are in a way very similar to emergency laws. They curtail protections and due process, but unlike emergency laws, terror laws like the PTA is permanent. It's started off for 3 years as temporary, but it became permanent. And if the ATA comes into being, it will be permanent. And it's also not subject to parliamentary review, unlike the emergency laws, which has to be, in order to continue, the parliament has to approve it, although the president has the power to declare it. And the government can use this for any offense they may define as terrorism instead of using the criminal laws. And I think that is what the ATA has done, allowing the government, any government, the future, present or future, to call almost any offense as a act of terror. The PTA has kind of terrorized Sri Lankans, particularly ethnic minorities, especially Tamils, and also journalists, activists, opposition politicians in Sri Lanka. But after the Easter Sunday attacks, even Muslims were subjected to a lot of harassment, and they were, many were arrested unjustly and kept for prolonged detention. So basically, the PTA is a license for torture, sexual violence, enforced disappearances, and prolonged detention. This is how it has been for 44 years, a kind of a license. And I think here you can see the photo of our late friend, Shanta, who was detained for about 250 days. And finally, he was discharged. I was also arrested under the PTA. I was released much quickly, thanks to many people's interventions. So this has been widely used even against church workers. This is an opposition politician who was arrested under the PTA. This is Tamil journalists and media workers who were arrested under the PTA. So there has been many such stories of how the PTA has been used. As far as I understand, and I think we can ask Bhavani if you have questions on this, there are many offenses in the penal code that is related to terrorism. So I see many, when I read it, from a layperson's view, I see similarities in what is in the penal code and what is in these various terror laws, the PTA, the ATA, and also things that were brought in before that. And we also have certain laws related to terrorism. I'm not going to go into the provisions because I think it was dealt very comprehensively. So the next step is the tabling in Parliament. It could be any time at the whim and fancy of the minister. So once tabled, concerned persons can file court cases. We will have 2 weeks, and the court may determine that, may or may not determine some provisions violate the constitution. It may say it will need 2/3 majority to pass and or a referendum. So that's the kind of the
You're muted, Ruki. We don't hear you.
sorry. So I see different kind of platforms of struggle. I think first there must be a ideological, spiritual dimension, particularly as a church group. We must see, based on our spirituality, based on our beliefs, whether this is evil, sinful law or unjust law, or whether it's a law that God would agree with. That's, I think, the most spiritual. And also even for people who don't identify with a particular religion, there must be ideological, political basis based on values and attitudes. How whether we think this law is just or not. And then the more practical ones are the, I think, legal ones. And there has been many efforts. Even when there were amendments in 2022, there were legal challenges to 2018 when the Counter-Terrorism Act, there was an attempt to bring something called Counter-Terrorism Act. There were legal initiatives going to the Supreme Court. And then the more social political kind of initiatives like this. This is a kind of a combination of a physical and an online event. There were many online events that I have been part of as well, and many others. I said even today in Trincomalee there was one that I was part of. There's been protests in the streets. There's been quite a lot of coverage in the media. In terms of my first slide was about a nice cartoon. So there is the arts also that can play a role, and there's also been some international attention as well towards this. So by and large, some expression of concern has been there internationally. Sorry, I think I seems to have got stuck. So I also feel it's important to have clear positions, and I want to highlight a clear example of the Catholic Archbishop of Colombo. In April 2019, he has said that amending the PTA is wiser than introducing counter-terrorism laws. And he's just after the Easter Sunday attacks. So 2019. So amending the PTA was his position. But in February 2022, last year, when there was a major campaign by opposition parties, Archbishop's position was to abolish the PTA, not to amend. So it's two different positions. Amending is different, abolishing is different. And I think it's important that we come to a clear position. What I strongly feel is that the PTA is beyond reform. We saw some reform, cosmetic, superficial reforms in 2022, but it did not do anything much to the spirit and overall framing and the overall kind of impact of the PTA. And also I feel there is no need to replace the PTA. So at the moment, what we have, the ATA is an attempt at replacing the PTA. There was a similar attempt in 2018 with something called CTA, and there has been other attempts as well. So basically, what I feel is that the ideal position is withdraw the ATA and repeal PTA. And I want to highlight the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka position on the PTA. This is from last year, February 2022. So where the chairperson of the Human Rights Commission, which is still the same chairperson, a retired judge, says that the commission believes that the offense of terrorism should be included in the penal code, the new definition for terrorism. Basically, it's advocating that the PTA should be abolished and there should be no replacement. And the usual code of criminal procedure applicable to investigating, prosecuting crimes should also be applicable in this case. And that's a public position taken by the Human Rights Commission. And I believe they had promised that they will be sending a letter to the president along similar lines. It should have gone today or maybe tomorrow. So I think the key demand should be to repeal the PTA. This could be, of course, the easiest would be by the government or even by a private member's bill that will require a majority in parliament, simple majority. And the cabinet must withdraw the ATA. But if it's tabled in parliament, then parliament must vote against it, which means that we have to convince the parliamentarians. And we also know that when some significant bills are kind of brought before parliament and voted on to make them an act, to make them a law, sometimes we have a handful, sometimes like 10%, like 20 odd parliamentarians in parliament. So if you are serious, if the government actually brings the ATA to the parliament, after the Supreme Court special determination process is finished, if there is voting in parliament, I think it's important that we try to convince parliamentarians not to vote for this. If it's absolutely needed, we can advocate for introducing new amendments to the penal code, but after wide consultations, and use the existing legal provisions and criminal law procedures to deal with terrorism-related offences. And generally an immediate moratorium on the use of PTA, which the government has promised before, and justice for the present detainees. This could potentially be, some, I'm highlighting these for discussion, what we could base on as our demands. I'll stop here, and so that since Bhavani has gone into very detailed into the various problematic provisions. So I'll stop here so that we have much more time for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ruki. So then we can open the floor to a discussion. So if there are any questions to Bhavani or to Ruki, please go ahead. And maybe we'll take about 3 questions at a time so that we can cover more ground. So please go ahead. It's open for questions now. Yes, please, it's also open to everybody who is online. So anybody who wants to come in online, please raise your hand online and then come in. So since we are waiting for questions, I'll start with a couple. Oh, there was. Oh, please go ahead, Jaisiri.
Thank you very much for both the presentations. May I ask a simple question? Is ATA trying to make the ordinary citizens terrorists?
A simple answer, yes.
I'll also come in with a question while others are thinking. So do we know actually who is behind this? Although we say it is the government, it has to be some group of people. So do we know which groups or groups, or do we have an idea?
And Ruki can also come in here. So the Justice Minister himself has publicly said that he appointed a committee that drafted this. The committee comprised of several lawyers, including some from the Attorney General's department. And that committee worked with him, gave him the draft, and that draft is what we are seeing. Now, the cabinet has approved this. That's how it got gazetted. So technically, one would say the cabinet has seen it and said, okay. But after the pressure and the criticism came about, there's now some in cabinet who has come out and said there are problematic clauses. So that raises the question whether certain actors in government push through this without really consultation even within the government. So I mean, that's an assumption I'm making, but from what's in the public domain, it's very much driven by the Minister for Justice with the involvement of security establishment. They have been very involved.
Ruki, do you also have anything to add on that?
Well, I don't really know who is behind, no, but what appears is that this is very much backed by the president, the present president, because we saw many such very similar drafts coming during the time when he was the prime minister as well. But we also know that some people in the government even on TV, I saw on a TV show a couple of days and saying, I haven't even read it and I don't know about it. So there are definitely divisions within this government, and we know the nature of this government as of now. And so I'm not very clear, but certainly I strongly feel that in addition to the minister, the president is also very much behind it. Although the president might think of kind of holding it back, and particularly when there's a lot of heat felt nationally and internationally. And I also agree with the first comment, that ATA is trying to make terrorists out of ordinary citizens, farmers or students or fisherfolk or anyone who basically might come out and critique, challenge, question the government in power, and not just this government, any government.
Thank you, Bhavani, and thank you, Ruki. It makes us very frightened, actually, the provisions of this act. My question is actually, why now? Why now? What is the president or the cabinet trying to achieve by introducing this at a point where Sri Lanka is highly vulnerable economically, and knowing very well that the European Union will come out very strongly against it? Why now? And yeah, the second part of the question is, how does it compare with anti-terrorism laws in so-called democratic countries? Thank you.
Ruki, you want to take that and I can come in after you.
So the why now? I think there is a lot of unrest, and particularly with the IMF loan, I think there's likely to be more unrest, particularly from groups who are going to be very badly affected economically. So I think the protests are likely to increase in all forms, like we saw last year. Maybe not in the same way and to the same extent, but there will certainly be protests. And I think the government is anticipating such protests. And I think there is a clear kind of a how can I say, there is something wording implies, particularly trade unions and student unions. And we have also seen that the way that the 3 student union activists were arrested and detained when Ranil Wickremesinghe signed the detention orders at that time. So that's, I think, what I feel could be the rush. And also, but I would not say that the European Union and other international actors are taking a strong position. I think they are taking a very kind of a compromise position. They're not coming out very clearly enough, I think. And also, I think in terms of the positions that I outlined, the position of the European Union and many Western countries is that anti-terror law or counter-terror law that is in line with the international human rights standards is acceptable, which I think is not does not consider the political, social political context of Sri Lanka and how such a law has been abused. I have to admit that I don't know much about the contents and the way that these kind of laws have been used in the kind of more established democracies. So I can't really comment on that. But what I feel in general is that many of the Western democracies and some even in Asia have strong check and balance systems, where their institutions are generally more independent and the executive doesn't wield so much power. So in those situations, there is less reasons to be alarmed than in a context where there is a lot of there's very little check and balances, and there is already kind of overwhelming executive power.
We'll let you also come in on that, Bhavani, and then Reverend Wilson Nanadas has a question. He raised his hand, but first we'll listen to you.
So what Ruki said is right. I think the timing is that they foresee, the government foresees more and more protests building in the coming months. And because some of the other measures they tried to bring in last year were challenged or pushed back, this is their answer. That's one issue. So for example, the 3 emergencies that were introduced last year were all are challenged in the Supreme Court. They tried to bring in a high security zone, which was also lots of people critiqued, and the government had to withdraw that. The Rehabilitation Authority bill I mentioned, that was challenged. So this is kind of a broad, very comprehensive in a way response from the government to cover everything, so that they don't need to then bring in other laws. This will cover pretty much everything when it comes to protest, dissent, critical debates, all of that. There is also one other dimension is the government has committed to repeal the PTA and replace it with international standards according to the UN Human Rights Resolution. There is an oral update coming up in June this year. So I suspect this and other things they're trying to do, including setting up a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, other things like that, is also to show that there's some movement here on the ground. Also the issue is a GSP plus, that PTA, repealing PTA is part of those conditions. And there is a review coming up next month. That's in about 10 days time. So I think these are also to address some of the international pressure points, but largely in a way, if you look at some of the offenses, the proposed offenses, it's really to stop any protests, stop any critical reporting, any media institution that's critical of the government or government policies could be targeted. So it's really shutting down of freedom of assembly, freedom of association, freedom of movement, freedom of speech. So you need to kind of keep a broader view considering everything the government has tried to do in the last couple of months.
Thank you for that. So Reverend Wilson, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, my question is that do we adhere to the terrorism prevention branch of the UN? For instance, there is a clause which says that measures must be taken to interrupt or ban or prevent preparation for terrorist violence, rather than catching the perpetrators and punishing them after a fatal event. Then my second question is this, does this act in any manner contradict the ICCPR, which ensures the right to life? So are these, can we just go ahead implementing and enacting laws without adhering to the strict guidelines of the United Nations, because we are part of it? And also, these were the two questions, but just to make a small statement, even during Premada's regime, there was something called the censor board. Every news item, every news feature had to be presented to the censor board. And the censor board decides what should be published and what should not be published. And also then subsequently we had this white van, and where people were harassed, people were killed, abducted. So I suppose whether with PTA or ATA, the government has its own way of scuttling the process, scuttling the human rights or denying human rights. But anyway, that is just apart from that. But my questions were the two questions about the UN regulations. Thank you.
Please go ahead.
So on the UN and the ICCPR, I mean, that's what I think I mentioned at the very outset. There are international standards on terrorism, but they're very clear, very specific. And even the special rapporteur on counter-terror and human rights have come out and said any proposed laws has to be very, very like drafted in a very narrow manner. Any broad vagueness could lead to abuse. And this is something very specific that she even sent to Sri Lanka when the counter-terror proposal was also being drafted. Now, that's one issue, and Sri Lanka seemingly says we are engaging with the UN, the Security Council resolutions and all of the mechanisms set up. I mean, there is a counter-terror framework international that is in place. Now, that said, what is being done is way beyond the remit of what is internationally accepted. The other thing on the ICCPR, now you mentioned the International Convention. Sri Lanka has the ICCPR Act that is Sri Lankan law. That is also, there's some issues that are very problematic. One is the whole issue of incitement. I mentioned that there is a clause here as well. So what the government is also trying to do is bring language that's in other laws which are problematic or have been used in a very problematic way to weaponize and target particular communities. So on ethnic religious grounds is here, but that is not a terrorism definition that is in the ICCPR. So that question also needs to be raised as to why is it that various things are being brought in here when there's existing law. But a broader comment, and Ruki mentioned this, the Human Rights Commission last year came out with this recommendation that the penal code should be looked at and reforms brought in, new provisions brought in through the penal code. The Law Commission also has come up with a draft several years ago, which is very, very clear and precise. So I think there's been things that are drafts that have been done. And the question is, okay, if you want to look at something, then look at what has already been done, but have a wide consultation. Having a very secretive process also raises questions. Who is driving this and who's going to benefit with having such a law in place in Sri Lanka?
Ruki, do you want to add anything?
Right. I think in terms of the first one, the prevention, yes, there is one of the kind of, I think the key, the UN's global counterterrorism strategy, as I remember, had 4 pillars. And the very first one is addressing the conditions conducive to the spread of terrorism, addressing the conditions that lead to terrorism. So that is social economic in nature. Like, for example, in the case of Sri Lanka, when we are plunged into a situation of people can't have food to eat, and with no electricity or no fuel or like that, no medicine and all that, that could be the breeding ground for terrorism. So in a way, that is a, in the prevention strategy, in the UN's global counterterrorism strategy 4 pillars, addressing the conditions conducive to the spread of terrorism is seen as a key part of preventing terrorism. And then, of course, there is the second part is more the other measures if there is terrorism to kind of try to prevent. But we also saw that the Easter Sunday attacks in the more recent times, 4 years ago, and we had the PTA at that time. And, still the Easter Sunday attacks happen, and there has been a lot of news, widespread news about how information about that was made available to very senior level government officials very early on, but also even a few days before. So still it was not prevented despite us having this PTA. So much for the kind of, these kind of laws and for prevention. So in terms of the ICCPR, I think some key things from the ICCPR is freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, freedom of association. All these are severely compromised at executive convenience and at the women fancy of the executive by the ATA. But even other provisions to prevent arbitrary arrest and detention is compromised by the ATA. This idea of presumption of innocent until proven guilty is also compromised in many ways by the ATA, even by the PTA, because the suspects are expected to prove their innocence in some ways. But also the detention orders and even prohibition of an organization is a punishment in a practical sense. It is not called punishment legally, but when someone is detained for a very prolonged period as a suspect, that is a punishment. I don't know what else to call it. So that is a punishment before a person is deemed as a wrongdoer or convicted as a wrongdoer by a court of law. So in all these ways and many other ways, I think the ATA contradicts the ICCPR.
Yes, Father Aaron, please.
Thank you for the presenters. The law that we find here or to be implemented or to be discussed is a kind of a law that we feel that it is very corrupted. It's very abusive. Now it's a small team that drafted this law. My question is, do they take the principle of ethics into consideration? And how law can separate, I mean, are there laws that, doesn't have an ethical stand, ethical principle or a moral value? And these laws are actually supporting a small group of people to continue to be in power. And I can't see this team that drafted this bill even have a moral conscience. So who is going to look into these checks and balances? And can this thing happen? And why this thing has to happen like this? Thank you.
I think all of us will agree with you in this around this table. But I think also what we see is that there are many people who are highly educated, highly cultured, who can do very cruel things. No, I mean, if you think of Nazi Germany, they have a Nobel Prize winning scientists. They have men and women who would go and listen to concerts of Wagner and Mozart and Beethoven and go and see plays by Goethe, who also just kill people because they were Jews, the same men or same women. So I think human fallenness has no limit. Please go ahead. Yes, Father Selvan, please go ahead.
Thank you for the presentation and also the sharing. Is what kind of evolution we are thinking? I agree with Father Adrian. I think the problem that in our day-to-day life, where our stances are, even in the church, and also you see the people's uh, what kind of alternatives we are search for as an option, whether the people's movement or it's something should come from the top, executive president or episcopal church. These are the issues and the tension, and we sometimes very comfort with the laws and in order to silence the community. I think you see, I can remember that in the World Council of Churches General Secretary came, that day the Hartal in the Northeast, but nothing mentioned on that because it is not very much highlighted. And also there are so many issues are taking place, people are in protest, but in a very smaller way, and also there's a decline because if you engage in, then you will be in trouble. So even if you go to the courts, that will take years and years. So I think it is our duty to resist. So I think how we are going to resist, that's what I think we have to think and suggest now. Thank you.
May I please add something? Now, in the history of our country, we know the so-called anti-conversion bill, which was challenged by many Christian groups. But what has happened today? The church in general is silent over this. So what can we do? So with that, I want to make a suggestion. Father Selvan and Hillary to follow up, if possible, to organize exhibitions through drawings and writings in all the parishes in the church, in all our churches. People to express the people's protest.
What can we do?
On the bill? So a question was asked, what can we do on the bills? And but it's also a broader comment. On the bill, as I mentioned, it's not yet tabled in Parliament. So there is that window to put a lot of pressure to get the government to withdraw the bill. That would be the best scenario. Because as soon as it goes to Parliament, then it goes to, assuming there will be lots challenging. We will be challenging. I've been told others will also come in. Because when you challenge it, then the Supreme Court has a role. And the Supreme Court, with the CTA, actually said it can pass with amendments. Now it's a different Chief Justice and all of that, but one never knows. You don't want to take a chance by having that law dangling. So the best would be now to put a lot of pressure, and there is a lot that has already been done. I would say, I mean, while we talk about it, we have achieved some things with this. The government, their initial plan was to ram through this bill. There was no accident in gazetting it at the end of March, because that meant 2 weeks later or a week later, they could table it in Parliament. The initial plan, which the Justice Minister himself has publicly said, was we were going to table this on the 4th of April. Why that's a significant date was 4th of April meant the 2 weeks would run to challenge it during the middle of the new year. That is also court vacation. All lawyers go on court vacation. So that was their plan, to ram through it and have very limited discussion and space to challenge. We were very critical. Many of us were very critical, raised concerns, and there was so much pressure on the government, they didn't table it on the 4th of April. They tried to table it this week. That also was met by a lot of pressure. So they are very aware there's a lot of pressure from across various groups, not just civil society and lawyers, various groups have come out publicly and critique. So one needs to recognize that this government's initial plan has faced setbacks. And that pressure has to be kept to ensure this doesn't go through the next phase. So ideally, loud demands to withdraw this, but also if they want to do any law reform, to have those transparent consultations. That's one thing. But this is, as I mentioned, this is not an isolated law. This government has used different laws, the emergency regulations, the PTA, the Rehabilitation Authority, attempts of a high security zone, various tactics to prevent protests, but also public debate. So that trend is going to continue, be it under the ATA or something else. So I think it's important, incumbent on us, all of us, the church, civil society, lawyers, media, others, to keep being very vigilant and scrutinize what's happening and send a very loud message that what is being done is to curtail people's freedoms. And when there's a clear demand for a system change by people, this is going contrary to those demands. When there's a clear demand for accountability, for transparency, for checks and balances, this is consolidating one office. So they're completely ignoring the people, not just ignoring the people, trying to bring tools to repress the people. So that discourse needs to happen. And I mean, you all can decide how best to do it through the church, but I think that public discourse is so important to show that there are different tactics to repress people, but also show some of the victories, that this bill remains a bill because people push back. I think that's so important.
Please,
I'll
sorry,
add
go ahead, Ruki. Please go ahead.
I'll add some thoughts also on that. And I think it's important to recognize that the PTA over the 44 years or so has affected disproportionately the Tamil people and since 2019 Muslims. I think that is important to recognize. Without that, it's difficult to move on because some of the discussions that happen around Colombo in the last month or so doesn't necessarily see it that way. We have to recognize that this is a law that is racist in nature. And then, of course, it is also targeted dissenters, but essentially it has primarily targeted Tamils and then Muslims. And it's important to recognize because it can happen again. I also do agree with Bhavani that maybe the government is feeling some heat. That's why it didn't kind of table it in Parliament in early April, and neither did it table it early this week, as it had said it might do. So maybe it's feeling the heat of a lot of kind of a pressure nationally and as well as internationally. But I think the churches has been relatively silent. I hope, I think there is a statement that is expected to come out of the NCC. I hope it will come out sooner than later. That is not stay in the discussion level among the heads of churches for too long. But also, I think once it comes out, assuming it will come out, I think it's important to share it proactively So just issuing a statement to the media, putting it on a website is not enough. I think the church leaders must be, both lay leaders and clergy must be kind of encouraged to share it and talk about it as a very evil, as a very sinful law. And like someone mentioned, I think some form of protest is important physically in the streets or at least even in churches. I think the idea of exhibition about the is good. There's a lot of material that can be used for that kind of exhibitions. I think Bhavani talked about the legal cases. So I want to mention also that although we don't know when it will be tabled, no, it could potentially be in a few days. It could be like next Tuesday or Wednesday. So then we will only have 2 weeks. So rather than scramble, then I think we have now some time to start preparing petitions now, petitioners now, talking to potential petitioners and getting ready now. We don't need to wait till the government actually tables it in parliament to do our groundwork and homework. The groundwork and the homework can be done now. As soon as it's tabled, then it can be filed in the Supreme Court for a special determination. So I think it's very important to do the groundwork now. And this will require some spiritual commitment, I would say, for churches to go to courts and to challenge it through the legal system. So it will require some kind of a particular decision. So I think the leaders will have to do it, but it doesn't necessarily have to be at the national level leadership. It can be at any level. It's also, I think, is important to publicize. If people who go to court, so it's good to publicize it because it's not just a legal act. It must also be a social, political act going to the Supreme Court to challenge a law, unjust law like the ATA. And also, I think the churches also have should be able to mobilize resources to support normal citizens who want to go to courts, but who find it very difficult to go to courts. Now, this has to be done in Colombo. So for people outside Colombo, it's really very difficult. It's also very expensive. Lawyers are very expensive. Even if there are some lawyers who will appear free of charge, there's lots of other costs involved for instructing attorneys, documentation, and so forth. That is really very expensive. The language is very problematic. Some petitioners that I've been discussing with, they don't converse in English. So they need to see what they're signing up for. So they need to see the petition in Sinhala and Tamil before they sign up English version. They need to know what it's all about. So I think these are all areas: translation, no money, no finding lawyers, organizing people so that they can be in Colombo is all things that churches can be involved in if they don't want to be petitioners themselves. Or maybe in addition to being petitioners, they can also support others. And also, I think this is a very good initiative. But I think more like this can happen at different levels, even at a parish level, even at a kind of regional level. And also, I think churches are also very international bodies. So the different churches, and I'm talking in plural, should mobilize their international arms, brothers and sisters, particularly like the World Council of Churches, for example, to raise their voices against this anti-terrorism act.
Ruki and also Bhavani, what is the position of the Mahanayakas?
I have not seen anything. Maybe I have missed something, but if maybe even among the participants, if there's any sense, I think it'll be very useful and interesting to know. So sorry that I'm not like, I'm a bit ignorant on that.
So there's been some briefings to the Mahanayakas. They haven't publicly yet commented. There are other Buddhist clergy who have and opposed it. Mahanayakas haven't indicated whether, I mean, as far as I know, haven't publicly commented, but they have raised concerns privately.
Well, why is the NCC delaying to come up with something, or anyone else? I think that was a point that was made, I think, by Ruki. Right? That the NCC hasn't said anything. Oh, over to you.
Bishop, Bishop, it was released, Bishop. I just circulated on the clergy group, I put it. Just a little while ago.
People may not have heard. Go ahead, Father.
That statement was released and I just sent it on to the circulator on the clergy group right now. The last 1 minute. I sent it.
Okay, the statement has been released, right, from the NCC. I also found it useful.
That's great.
Sorry, go ahead.
That's great to hear.
Found it interesting when I asked this question about who are the political forces behind it. Both of you replied about the justice minister. That's clear because it's coming through him. And you all both mentioned the current president, but haven't, I mean, I don't know, it's a question to the whole group. The whole discussion on terrorism, as far as I know, uh, took a new step forward during the Aragalaya when there were strong Vietmaga groups, Vietmaga academics, Vietmaga lawyers, Vietmaga business people, and even grassroots level people who were calling the Aragalaya terrorists. And I thought that this bill actually flowed from that strand, which even on July 9th, accused Aragalaya people of having been engaged in terrorism to get rid of their president. You all didn't hear that?
Yes, it has been there. I mean, that kind of talk has been there. And I think the rest of the three student leaders who are very prominently involved in the Aragalaya was an indicator of that. But we can't say for sure, but definitely that kind of a thinking is present. Even when we read between the lines, the terminology used in the ATA, that is there. And that is why I think we both mentioned that, no, at least on my side, that the rationale seems to be to prevent anything like that happening again.
Also, with that, the change that happened in July, there was a whole discourse during the Aragalaya period when the previous president was in office that we need to actually get rid of the executive presidency. But with the change of president, that whole demand has disappeared. In a way, it's almost like there is a large number of people in the country who aren't really concerned about the powers of an executive president as against parliament and so on. It's more personality driven. People didn't trust Gotabaya Rajapaksa, they do trust Ranil Wickremesinghe. So that whole discussion on the change in the executive president's powers has suddenly got diluted.
Can I just come here? I don't think it has disappeared. The demand is there. Less in terms of particular who captures it. So a survey we did, 76% supported abolishing the executive presidency. Now, I think under this present president, because the queues have reduced or non-existent in some areas, the power cuts have reduced, people, the middle class at least, have kind of gone back to the status quo as before to the Aragalaya, yeah? So the demands in a way have been limited to the particular individuals who've been very active and actors who've been pushing for the demand. But it's also about the narratives that are framed by particular individuals and elites, I would say. And I think that needs to be critiqued. Who is driving these things? Who is calling the protesters terrorists and fascists? So, I mean, that narrative captures, and then media comes in very strongly, particular media houses, social media pushes these narratives. That doesn't mean the demand for change hasn't gone away, but there are more dominant narratives. And that's the role that we all have to play. What is being articulated by particular individuals, institutions, particular leads to serve their own purposes. And I think these laws or proposals capture some of that thinking, that we need a strong leader to solve these problems. And that strong leader should have all powers, including repression, to stop any form of dissent. But I don't think the demand has gone away. It's just the way it has been captured, articulated is different.
I also feel that
Please
that
go
demand
ahead.
is not gone away. I think there is still a very large number, significant number, or maybe even a majority, who is for abolishing the executive presidency. And also, I think the positioning of the public changes after kind of turn of events. No, that is what happened to Gotabaya Rajapaksa. He was very popular when he was elected, and then in a couple of years he was no longer popular. So that those individuals, when it comes to personalities, the popularity can change overnight. No, I mean maybe not overnight, but over a period of time. But also, I think if you feel it's disappearing and if it's not strong enough, I think it's our role to kind of resurface it and strongly to bring it up again into the discourse, and question why this has not been acted on.
Do we close now, Himadi? Or
Bhavani
Bhavani
has
has
to
to
go, but
go,
we can-
right?
we
Yeah.
can-
Thank you very much. And this was very helpful. See you then. Thank you. Do we continue, Bishop, for a while, or do we close? What would you suggest?
Yeah, close, no?
So we'll close the discussion then. If you please go ahead, Father Jayasri.
Is it possible as a outcome from this seminar or discussion to organize something at parish levels and deanery levels?
Yeah, any response on that or anything else to suggest? Yeah. We'll wait for Bishop.
No, the letters. So that they can even change whether I'm signing second sheet.
Bishop, I think Father Jayasri had something.
My comment was whether it's possible as an outcome of this discussion for us to organize something at parish level. Otherwise, it will be too late.
What is possible for this, if you do it for this Sunday, if at all? What is possible for this Sunday? Today is Thursday.
Bishop, few things like this one in Colombo, if some seminars could be organized in the next few days at deanery level in Sinhala and Tamil. That's number one. And encourage the clergy to organize programs in their local churches, parishes. Can I come in here? As far as I can see, I attend about 3 or 4 churches. As far as I can feel and see, vast majority of the congregations, the communities are unaware of what's going on. So that I think the first thing should be that we should make these Christian communities, especially, I mean, we can start with our Anglican communities. We should make them aware of what they are facing, because everybody that I see is just floating around as if nothing is happening. So this, I think, should, as far as I can see, this is something we can address this coming Sunday.
I think by and large in the north, there are many are resisting, but the fear is there when you organize and resist what will happen. But I think in coming Sunday, we have to say these things from our pulpit. And also we can really pray for the issue so that we have all the right to do and everybody can engage in that. And ecumenical, wider ecumenically, there are programs. So we have to engage in. So that's a slow starting point. Then I think as a rep desk, we can come out with something for people to understand in a different way, simply. NCC statement is good, but it is not just easy to understand everything immediately. Thank you.
Jean shared the English, Sinhala and Tamil review of the ATA bill, and we have shared it with the board members, but if anyone else wants it, we can share it with all of you, because it's in all 3 languages, and that's very good, because generally we tend to limit this to the English speaking people, but it is very important also that we make it available to those who are Tamil speaking and who are more comfortable in Tamil and in Sinhala. So that statement is available. It's an analysis of the ATA bill, and it can be shared with anyone who wants to. Maybe Bishop, we can send it to the parishes as well under your.
If you can put it
signature.
immediately on the clergy group, I think. Huh?
Yeah, we can. Can we send it to you further? Can send it 5.
So maybe we can share that with the people also, no? And we can ask the clergy to print what number of copies they want and distribute it to the parishioners in the different languages. Yeah. Paper, I can't. So that's why I suggested that we ask the clergy to print if they want, and that now specific number, so that we don't waste. But if they all have WhatsApp groups, to put it in the on the WhatsApp groups.
So is it also possible to have a sort of discussion or
After the service on
maybe a
Sunday.
presentation after the service? Because I think most people will stay if you tell them that it's important. It's an important thing for them.
If you can put that also, that message also on the group. Tell the congregation and to look at ways in which you can engage the congregation after the service in a discussion on this topic.
Hillary, you had something, please.
What I was wanting to say is that if any particular parish or group or congregation wishes to have some expert opinion on this, the rep desk could arrange for that as well. But it obviously be difficult to wait for this Sunday, but at a later date.
After the bill is passed.
Hopefully not, but. Yes.
Reverend Noel, yes, Father Noel, please go ahead.
He's muted.
You're muted, Father Noel. You had to unmute. Yes,
yeah,
Father.
hello. Hello. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you now.
Yes. I would rather make a suggestion now to make a sort of a reflection on pulpit. I do not know how competent are we with the content of this bill. You know, there are a lot of like legal clauses and things like that. But based on what we discussed today, what the 2 speakers shared with us, maybe if the ref board quickly, we can't be waiting. Maybe now today is Thursday, at least, start working on some important points and to make it very simple, and use it as intercessory prayers. I think that will be more effective, and then keep on, Sundays and other services, pray as intercessory prayers. But you have to make it very, very, very simple. And also you can appeal the congregation in their own level, how they could engage. But we have to make it very simple without, having this legal jargons and all these things, so that, the rank and file in our on the pew will understand. Right. So it's not that they aren't aware. What I feel is people are helpless, and people's priority is more like they try to concentrate on how they could provide their needs, daily needs, right, and purchase their things, and they are in an economical battle. So they are really, I think the rank and file is not very much. I mean, there are a lot of, discussions like this. Experts are talking about it. People here on TV, at various forums, and there are activists involved. There are certain groups involved. Trade unions are involved. But the rank and file, they are aware of it, but their priorities are much bigger. It's an economical battle. So in that circumstances, in the given circumstances, I think we have to make it very, very simple for our congregations, people on the pew, to begin to think, begin to reflect. Thank you.
May I suggest one more thing, please? Write a half a page reflection to overthrow the president, just like Samuel overthrew King Saul when he anointed David.
Then you'll have two presidents, no? That is of the same. Then you'll have two presidents. Because Samuel anointed David while Saul was already there, then we had two. Now we're going to get rid of one. You'll have two. The level to lead the discussion, someone can hijack the thing in the parish level. Then there'll be different interest groups. Our churches are not all people who think alike. So you can't have a situation where the discussion is hijacked. So it has to be done very thoughtfully. Of course, we can encourage the clergy to talk about it and read about and to include prayers in the intercession and so on. Anyway, we'll inform the parishes to do as much as they can to disseminate the information that they have and to create awareness. And if they want expert advice and to share, then to be in touch with the rep desk in the days to come. And they will organize resource persons to go into the areas and do the workshops and whatever. Is that okay?
close now, Bishop? Or is there any final question, or Reverend Silva, or anything else, or should we close now?
I think
The Commission for Justice and Peace at the NCC, they also can actually get involved in this whole thing with the rap desk probably. Really work with Roman Catholics and the Methodists.
The Catholic Church, because they have the numbers, they have the reach, which we don't have. So if any of you can help us to do that, I think that will
So if you speak to Binu, Binu will help you connect with them.
be universal.
We'll close then. So thank you very much to all the participants. Thank you, Bishop, also for coming. And also to Ruki and Bhavani, who led the discussion and provided us with a lot of very important information. So we'll proceed from here. And thank you also, Mala, for organizing this. I mean, for facilitating this. Thank you.